Yeah, it was a struggle for the Husky defense throughout the entire game, really, especially against the run. And that's one of the reasons that our second topic is going to be devoted entirely to that. Something though, looking at the positives, trying to grab at them from that game against Stanford. I was kind of impressed with Dylan Morris. I mean, not like overly impressed, but he was a positive I could see from the game. He was coming off probably his worst overall game against Utah in his short career, where he threw 3 interceptions. And coming in here against Stanford, it was a relatively safe game. He had 0 interceptions. He didn't throw any touchdowns besides the one that got called back because of holding, which I'll actually touch on later. But overall, he was 15 for 23, 254 yards passing, 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. He added some running with 7 carries for 36 yards and a touchdown. Overall, kind of just an average game from him. He finally was able to connect on a few deep passes, which is something that we'd been harping on over and over again as something he needed to improve on. He managed to connect on a few of those, and those were really the only big plays that happened for this Husky offense.
Yeah, but like on the topic of oh, sorry. On the topic of Morris, there were these 2 fouls against Morris and the Huskies, I think in the second or third quarter. That really just showed how inexperienced he is as a freshman as an incoming quarterback who's just young and doesn't really have that game time experience. I think one of them was a delay of game, and the other was something similar. Where
Are you talking about the first drive of the game where there was the 12 men on the field?
The 12 men in the field followed by the delay of game. Yeah, I mean, like the first one obviously wasn't really in Morris's control. You can't really dictate what your 12th player who gives you that foul is doing at the time, whether that was like a personnel change that got messed up or something. That's just something that shouldn't happen at the high school level, at the college level, at the professional level. You should never have more than 11 guys on the field unless it's like a huddle or water break. I mean, it's a dumb foul. You shouldn't be getting it. The second one, though, that delay of a game, that's never an excuse for a quarterback. I feel like you should be in charge of that game clock, that play clock especially, and you should be aware of it the entire time you're on offense and live on that field because of how important it is. I think we were looking at like a decent first down chance, like a pretty easy first down chance at that point, I think, until those fouls came up, right?
Yeah, I was going to talk about this a little later, but talk about it now, just how it was a 3rd and 5, and then they got the 12-men substitution foul 5 yards back, 3rd and 10, and even coming off of a penalty, they somehow get a delay of game, putting it at 3rd and 15, where they then couldn't convert, obviously.
Yeah, and it was some other things too. Morris really taking in stride, I think, those interceptions he threw last week, throwing less contested balls this game. Not throwing any interceptions, if I remember correctly.
He had 0 interceptions.
Yeah, zero turnovers for Morris, which is great. But I mean, again, there's that lack of throwing the contested balls, and oftentimes I think you could see on field him looking at that decision like, do I throw this tough pass right now or do I run it for those 3 yards? And I think almost all the time I saw him choose to run when I think he could have pulled off some of those passes.
Yeah, I think Morris this week, he clearly didn't do enough to win this game, but what he did would have been enough to win a game where the defense stepped up and made some plays, or they had a more solid running game. So overall, he didn't make enough plays this week to win based on what all was going on, but he did play kind of a game that is kind of what Jimmy Lake, I think, wants out of him, being cautious. I mean, you look at the first few weeks where they relied so heavily on the run, and that's what Jimmy Lake wants to see, and that's kind of the direction Dylan Morris played this game, only they didn't have that super great run game this week, and they didn't have that great defense to bail him out or to help make the game easier.
No, absolutely. And I think some of that comes down, I don't remember where I talked about this because I feel like all three of these segments had pretty similar themes or issues running through them with things we needed to talk about, address, and things that the Huskies needed to improve on. We were missing a couple of key players again, whether they were on the field or completely off. I mean, one guy doesn't make plays a game. That can't be an excuse for the rest of the defense. I mean, although, to be completely honest, going from like back to back games where you had All-American, like national award performances, and then running a game where you had goose eggs across your stat sheet is insane in my head. But at the same time, I feel like as a defense, like that's one guy who's not doing something. As a defense, you have 10 other people on the field who can be making tackles, making plays. And yeah, there were some seniors, juniors, sophomores who, like freshmen as well, who stood up and made those plays, but no one was there to replace that lack of impact that ZTF usually has. Like there was no one there to fill those shoes, even if there were still other people standing tall and making the occasional play. That's something that has to change heading into Oregon. Is like you just can't let your one-star player or a star player dictate how the rest of your defense or offense performs.
Yeah, they definitely weren't able to make up for the lack of production that ZTF usually brings. I mean, they had 0 sacks in the game, which ZTF, I guess, Stanford figured out how to block him, and then Stanford also just simply heavily relied on that run game. But then looking at a kind of a positive, you looked at people missing the game, and 2 guys who did miss the game that had been a focal on the offense, Trell Bynum and Puka Nacua at wide receiver. They both were gone for an unnamed reason, possibly COVID related. And in their place were Rome Odunze and Jalen McMillan, 2 true freshman wide receivers who've had a lot of hype. Through the first few weeks, they haven't had a ton of production. They've both kind of been plagued with drops. But this week, Rome Odunze really stepped up and he made some key plays. I mean, he led the team in catches with 5 receptions for 69 yards. He had a couple of nice catches. He did also have 1 drop again this week. But overall, the true freshman wide receivers played a solid game. And even Ty Jones, the veteran of the group, the junior for the wide receiver, he had his best game, I believe, as a Husky. He only had 2 catches, but he had that one amazing one-handed deep ball down the left side. And then he did have a touchdown catch that then, of course, got called back for holding. So I guess it doesn't count. But overall, the wide receiver group really stepped up in the absence of the 2 leaders in Nacua and Bynum.
Yeah, I was going to say Odunze did an absolutely fantastic job in fulfilling the role. I mean, he went with 5 receptions, 69 yards.
Yeah.
But I mean, then again, like you have to measure like a player's entire performance, and I feel like Odunze with his 2 rushing attempts at negative. I mean, I'm looking at stat sheet. Like every rush he's been on this season, like in 2020, has been for at least a conglomerate of negative yardage. He had 1 rush in our first game for -6 yards, and now he's had 2 rushes this game for a total of -10 yards.
I wouldn't really put the blame on Odunze. I just think that play hasn't worked, that kind of sneaky end around that they've tried with him. I mean, it kind of cost him this past game. It was a 2nd and 10. They ran it on, and it absolutely got blown up, and they lost 10 yards, and all of a sudden had a 3rd and 20.
Yeah, and I really don't know what it is about that play, because I mean, you see it succeed at every level from Pee Wee to the NFL, and it's just something about our team running it where it just doesn't ever really seem like it's doing all that great. I don't know what it is, whether it's a DN pull, if we're just way too obvious about it on offense. But I mean, it sucks that I think Odunze has had to run that a bunch of times.
I meant to look at that play over one more time. I wasn't able to squeeze it in, but the play with the Odunze where he lost 10 yards, it was kind of different than the previous ones they'd run. They actually motioned over a different wide receiver and then had him come over and it was just an odd play design that I'd never actually seen run. So, and it clearly didn't work. So maybe they can scrap that from the playbook.